Okay, so here we are with two of my favorite gurus. Gosh, Peter, I don't know when I ran across you. You were teaching on the East Coast, I know. I'll bet it was the 60s.
I was trying to remember myself. I don't remember when we met.
Right, I don't remember when we met either. And, of course, Harris and I went after you when you wrote your book, Spirit. I even read it when it was still in a draft form. You were so kind to send it to me. I said, now there's a warm soul. So let's talk about history. Let's talk about, Dr. Vail, your view of the history of OD, and with you, Harrison, let's talk about the history of open space. Let's talk about the history of your relationship, and so Peter, why don't you start about the history of...
I was just saying before we turned the tape on that I started my MBA at Harvard in the fall of '58, and that year we read Douglas McGregor's the essay, Human Side of Enterprise. The book wasn't out yet, in Mimeo. And then that same year, Robert Blake came through and used us as standardizing his 9119, concern for people, concern for productivity, all that stuff that became the managerial grid. All I really remember about Blake is that he looked like Cary Grant. He was the most elegant guy I think I'd ever seen. Although if you want to know about Blake, you ought to get Jerry Harvey on tape, because he was Blake's student, you know. So in that 58, so I was there in the MBA 58, 60, and then I was in the doctoral program 60 to 64. And in that 6-year period, The Human Side of Enterprise came out. Maslow published a couple of books. Bennis, Benning, and Chin, The Planning of Change, came out in 61. Hertzberg, 64, The Motivation to Work. Chris Argyris had a couple of books. Interpersonal Competence and Organizational Effectiveness was one. The Tavistock Socio-Technical Systems stuff was showing up in mimeograph form. That's the one thing my quarrel with the STS people is that they never published very much that you had access to. It's just Rensis Lickert, the New Patterns of Management, came out in 61. It was just a torrent. I mean, our heads were just spinning with these ideas about change. And the word OD didn't exist yet. The phrase OD didn't exist yet. And didn't exist until, you know, Blake and Beckhard argue about who invented the phrase. Beckhard thinks he invented it working with Pillsbury here in Minneapolis. And Blake thought he invented it working with Esso in New Jersey.
And Shepard thought he did.
And Shepard. Well, it was Blake and Shepard with Esso. And Beckhard and a guy named Cy Levy at Pillsbury,
right.
Who was a staple of the OD network for many years. But in 1967, there was a meeting in the industrial network in Montreal. Shel Davis and I went from the West Coast. I was representing UCLA, and he was representing TRW. And there were about a dozen people in the room, and that was the OD network.
All right.
And one of the points of the meeting was Jerry Harvey had been coordinating it for NTL, and he was turning it over to Warner Burke. It was still the property of NTL, though. And under Warner, from 67 to about 74, those 7 years, it grew from that room full of people to 3,000 members. And Warner is arguably the real soul of the founding of that OD network, because he's the one that, from a management and leadership point of view, he's the one that made something out of it. Really did. So when I was a doctoral student, my field was organizational change. My lead professor was a man named Paul Lawrence, who wrote a book called The Changing of Organizational Behavior Patterns in 1960 that won the McKinsey Prize as the best management book. And it was the story of Stop and Shop supermarkets going from no store manager with grocery, produce, and meat reporting directly up to grocery, produce, and meat at corporate, to going from that system to a system where you had a store manager coordinating everything. And it was agony for everybody to make that transition, and Paul documented it in this book. And it was all about interpersonal skills and learning. It was all about wave riding in your language. So I kind of grown up with it. I absolutely am not a founder of the idea, but I've been an observer of it, and a participant in it, and a great learner from it. Then I had the good fortune in '64. My first job was at the UCLA group, where everybody was an OD consultant, an OD therapist, led by Bob Tannenbaum, your great friend, Roland. And so that was a spiritually transforming experience for me. Southern California in the '60s was a transforming experience. But to work with Bob Tannenbaum and the other 7 people that he'd assembled there, Jim Clark was another star in that group. Will McWhinney was there.
Gellerman was there, maybe?
Who?
Bill Gellerman?
Bill Gellerman was the first graduate doctoral degree from that group, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
He had just left the system when I arrived in '64. He just graduated. Newt Margulis and Bill Gellerman were the 2 first graduates. So it was, it's one of these things where you just back into these opportunities. I backed into the Harvard Business School. I backed into the doctoral program. I backed into UCLA. I can't say I planned any of it. It's just kind of opening doors and going through them.
That may be a point that I can tie into, simply because I've never gotten a job that I went after. I never went after a job that I'd gotten. I never had a clue where it was all going to end. And as I listen to you tell the story of the 60s and early 70s, I have to say I was a total outlander. I mean, I did not even know what OD was, and it didn't exist. But while you were doing all those wonderful things, my area of interest was myth, ritual, and culture in the ancient Near East and Semitic languages and literature. And
you were in seminary, weren't you?
Well, seminary, graduate school, and teaching. But what was interesting as I look back on my own career and the way I think it eventually tied into our association and what followed was the subtitle of my dissertation, which would have been my PhD dissertation, save for the civil rights movement putting me on the street, was Chaos and Order in the Creative Process. But the data of my, if you will, thought experiments were the creation myths from Babylon and Egypt.
You were still talking that language when I met you in the middle '70s.
Well, the actual truth of the matter is I've never stopped.
Never stopped, yeah.
I mean, if there's a theme that kind of runs through all of my work, it's been chaos, order, and the creative process. And then subset to that is, okay, fair enough, we got a lot of chaos and sometimes order, and how do we effectively navigate that?
And I would say this, without using those words, although I've always been interested in creativity, but without using those words, my fascination has always been, as I say, moving things along in complex systems. And sometimes that gets discussed as leadership and management, but moving things along to me is almost a better descriptive phrase.
Well, that's really where we met.
Yeah.
I mean, I was, after I got done with the myth and ritual, which I never did, my next stop, of course, was the National Institutes of Health. We hadn't met then. We could have. And then the Veterans Administration when I was doing the VA Scholar Program. And you were my salvation.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, I had no problem putting the program together, but what I just thoroughly enjoyed was the endless conversations we had about strange things like myth, ritual, and culture.
I mean, there was the program you were running, and that I was, I don't know, what was I? I guess I was a site where the program was being.
Yeah, you were the bank.
Yeah.
Veterans Administration, we had a fair amount of money, but we couldn't spend it.
Well, who gave George Washington the money? Where'd the money come from?
We did.
From the VA.
Yeah.
you couldn't spend it directly on the program.
Right,
but
that's
you could-
right.
But you could give it to George Washington,
Exactly.
and George
This is
Washington.
called- The truth of the matter is, you've been laundering money.
That's starting to sound like that, isn't it?
Well, that's exactly what it was.
I had never thought of it that way, but it was, I guess it was $0.25 for about 5 or 6 years there.
Exactly.
And I was happy to be involved with it, and the VA scholars, the young men and women that we enrolled in that program were all delightful people, and smart as all get out, and fun to work with, all health professionals. So.
Well, you basically had to be at least a dean or almost a dean of a medical school to apply. I mean, so that.
You had to have a very distinguished record, that's right.
Anyhow, that was a lot of fun.
It was, yeah.
And I can remember one day saying, I mean, I had been a federal bureaucrat, and I used the word, they're good bureaucrats and bad, and hopefully I was a good one, for about 10 years. And all of a sudden I ran back into you, and I remember some of our first conversations were about the use of mythology in terms of understanding organizations.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
all of a sudden I found massive amounts of my sort of academic life coming back and having very practical application
Right.
in large systems.
And you know, I'm not sure I ever told you this, but the reason I was able to understand the language you were speaking and appreciated it was because the Harvard group that I had gone through as a student was itself full of traditions of cultural and social anthropology.
Oh, of course.
And the great breakthrough, in fact, the great breakthrough of the so-called Hawthorne experiments that Harvard had conducted 20 years earlier was to see the internal workings of a company as a small society, using ideas from the British cultural anthropologists of the teens and 20s.
Right.
And so I had to read all that stuff. Bronislaw Malinowski and A.R. Radcliffe Brown and Margaret Mead.
They're all my friends.
All that crowd, you know. So I was very ready to kind of hear. I didn't hear so much about myth and ritual. What I heard a lot about were roles and structure and tradition and hierarchies and all those kinds of things. Myth and ritual was all through that. I don't think I really began to appreciate myth and ritual until I met you, and then along came Joseph Campbell and taught the whole world about myth and ritual. But there was a kind of natural fit there of our interests, and we were both interested in how things get done in organizations, and you had this wonderful entrepreneurial flair that I've always appreciated, and I don't really have it myself, but I've always, I know it when I see it. And one of my old mentors, Fritz Rathburger, used to say, there are those who can do it, and there are those who can talk about it. But when you meet somebody who can do it and talk about it, pay attention. And you were one of those kind of people for me. You could do it and you could talk about it, and that made you somebody to pay attention to.